Good evening, everyone, and welcome. As most of you know, I'm Craig Snyder, the president of the World Affairs Council of Philadelphia. I want to welcome World Affairs Council members and guests joining us this afternoon from around the country. As you know, this event is part of the Council by Council Amplified Summit presented by World Affairs Councils nationwide. This week, councils from around the country are working together to highlight the power of our network, and we encourage everyone joining us today to support their local World Affairs Council. I want to especially thank all of you who have used our pay what you want option for this program. Obviously, revenues for our organization, like most others, have been hard hit by the current situation, and we need obviously to earn your continued support in order to continue to provide this content. If you have any technical issues that come up during the program, please use the question bar. The Council's Vice President for Programs, Haley Boyle, will be able to help you behind the scenes. Later in this hour, we're going to take some questions from you, the audience. The way that works is that for you to ask a question, you should use your raise hand button. And if selected, I will announce your name. You'll receive a prompt to unmute your audio, and you'll be able to then ask your question out loud for everyone in the webinar to hear before being muted again. So with that, on to our discussion. As you know, we are joined this afternoon by Congressman Ted Yoho, representative for Florida's 3rd District and ranking member of the House Foreign Affairs Subcommittee for Asia, by Dr. Susan Shirk, research professor and chair of the 21st Century China Center at UC San Diego, and Dr. Yachon Wahong, senior fellow for global health at the Council on Foreign Relations, and the author of the forthcoming book, Toxic Politics, China's Environmental Health Crisis and the Challenge to the Chinese State. We're going to be discussing the future of China and the relationship between the United States and China going forward. And I'd like to ask each of our guests to make a few minutes of opening remarks, and then we'll dive deeper together. Susan, would you start us off?
Sure. The COVID-19 pandemic has really tested the US-China relationship, and it's pretty clear that relations have failed the test, because instead of working together to address the overwhelming threat of the pandemic and to figure out how together to start to develop therapies, vaccines, and to prevent more people from dying, the leaders of the two countries are deflecting criticism of the way they themselves have handled the epidemic by blaming the other. And this is really tragic, because in the past, US and China, despite their many differences and disputes, managed to work together pretty well on previous epidemics. And even the United States and the Soviet Union during the Cold War managed to combine forces and together led the world to eradicate the blight of smallpox completely from the world. So those are examples of what we could be doing and should be doing, but sad to say, instead, the epidemic has just shown us how much mistrust, suspicion there is between the two countries. So the challenge is, how can we overcome that in order to save lives?
Thank you. Yachon?
Sure. Just continuing what Susan just said, I think instead of we seeing the pandemic bring the two countries together, we're seeing them actually further apart, because of the pandemic. Seeing the two countries, like finger pointing, blame shifting, buck passing, who should be responsible for the pandemic. And this morning I was reading this WeChat comments, because I was in that WeChat group with my former high school classmates, most of them in China. It was I saw this. They were sharing the video clip of the Ambassador Max Baucus. It was the claiming, now we seems to be entering a MacArthur era, right? I think one of my classmates then commented to say, "Wow, now the U.S. the anti-China the sentiment is really strong." And they always say, "Gee, well, you could say the same thing about China, but this anti-American sentiment is equally strong." Because if you watch the CCTV just over the past 1 or 2 days, was all the criticism against the United States, calling Secretary Pompeo the so-called enemy of the people. This is very, very strong rhetoric, and it is very unfortunate that this has to be that way. And and just a couple of hours ago, I saw the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal carried this opinion piece by the president of the Council on Foreign Relations, Richard Haas, said, "Don't start a new Cold War with China." I feel like, gee, now we need to think China is the former Soviet Union, but the problem is that China is not the former Soviet Union, right? Because if you look at the Soviet Union's GDP, even at its best time, it was less than half of the US GDP. But as early as 2018, China's GDP was already 2/3 of the United States, and the gap continued to narrow. So we're going to, even though we can still win the war in the future showdown with China, but the American people, this is going to pay dearly for that strategic choice. I will stop there.
Thank you. Jonathan.
Number one, thank you, Craig, for hosting this. I appreciate it. Susan, Yan, Sean. I look forward to this dialogue because I think it's so important. One cannot measure our response to China or China's response to ours in a single moment of time. What we have to do is look over history. And if we go back to 1949, when Mao Zedong set a 100-year goal for him, and Michael Pillsbury in his book, 100-Year Marathon, laid out the scenario of what China wants to do. We're 75 years into that plan. And so we need to look at the broader picture of what China's intent is. And I think if we understand what their ultimate goal is, and this was very succinctly said by Xi Jinping, I believe it was the 17th Communist Party Congress, where he said the era of China has arrived. No longer will we be made to swallow our interests around the world. It's time for China to take the world center stage. And then we can look at things that are self-evident. The rare earth metal supplies, they have pretty much cornered the market on that. The supply chains, if you look at APIs, the active pharmaceutical ingredients, they have the second largest economy. They're building their military. They're giving us a run. In fact, they're ahead of us in telecommunications and 5G network around the world. And then it's a foot race that's neck and neck with AI and quantum computing. I think what we need to do to further our relationships is we need to focus on those things that we can agree on, obviously. We've shared this with a lot of people, a lot of different nations around the world, that we don't want to compete with China militarily. Economically, that's fine. And I think if we compete economically, and the way we can do that is looking at the pandemic, look at the things that have come to light. And I think the supply chains is a real big one. Again, I want to reiterate, they have cornered the market on rare earth metals. The APIs, they control 85 roughly %. If we even look at the vitamins and minerals or the medicated feed that goes into our livestock feed, they can control that. They control the minerals and the trace minerals that go into our fertilizers, and the list goes on and on. So they've been very good at what they've done. Our conflict is not with the Chinese people, it's with the Chinese Communist Party. And we can look at what they're doing in the South China Sea or the East Sea, and these are things that we see this active aggression. I had a talk with Madeleine Albright today with the House Foreign Affairs Committee. There is Dr. Twiney on there and Mr. Mitchell, and all of them, and not just them, but I hear over and over again, we need China. That's true. But on the flip side of that, China needs us. And I think that gives us room diplomatically that we can approach this to make both of our countries stronger. And we shouldn't be competing on a world stage in an adversarial manner. It should be open and fair and transparent competition. And I think, as Craig, you brought up, or Dr. Yanchi, about working together on medical issues, those are the things that we really need to put our efforts behind. And I look forward to this discussion to talk more about that.
Thank you. Thanks to all of you. Congressman, let me pick up a couple of the threads that have come forward. Just this morning, I got an email, a fundraising solicitation from somebody running for Congress in the Philadelphia suburbs. It's rare when such a communication is focused on foreign policy at all. But here's what this said. Just going to read a part of it for our audience. The Chinese Communist Party must be held to account. We need to make sure this never happens again. This week, we learned that the Department of Homeland Security compiled intelligence reports making it clear that China intentionally lied to the world about the coronavirus in order to buy time to hoard critical medical supplies. We must hold them to account, and this is why I've released a plan, Bring Back American Manufacturing. We need to protect critical supply chains. We need to manufacture critical military and medical equipment here in the United States. It occurs to me that you can find that kind of sentiment coming now on both sides of the aisle from people running in this year's elections. And I guess I want to ask each of you to react to the notion of the accusation against China being used as the basis for what could be a confrontational attitude in American politics. Susan, why don't we start with you again?
Well, China bashing is not uncommon in American politics. We've had it for a long, long time. So it's not surprising to see it again. And I think that in the past, the cost of that to our national interests was not really all that severe. It wasn't like we were losing the possibility of trading with China or working together with China on public health or climate change or other things, because they seem to go on. After the election, we'd get back to actually trying to do what Congressman Yoho is talking about, which is actually trying to negotiate on the most harmful things that China is doing to our interests and trying to make progress on them, which is the way we do this. We compete peacefully. But this time, the consequences of politicizing the China issue should be evident to everyone. People are going to die because of this. If the United States and China can't lead the international effort to develop the therapies, develop the vaccine, test it, manufacture it, and fairly distribute it around the world, people in our own country, in China and other countries, more people will die. So I see the consequences of us just basically sacrificing relations with China in order to make individual politicians look tough and strong as really disastrous this time around. I mean, it's probably going to happen, but what I hope will happen is that there will be some voices that will take a more rational approach and say that we have so many different values from China, so many different disputes, but now is the time to put them aside and to make the primary focus how we're going to join our efforts in order to address the pandemic and the global economic fallout that is also flowing from it.
Congressman, let me come back to you. Is it irrational to say that there is something, perhaps more than one thing, for which the Chinese should be held accountable in the release of the virus to the world? And is it irrational for people to talk more about self-reliance in supply chains?
No, I don't think so on either account. I think, China needs to be held accountable. And I think what we're looking for is honesty. We held one of the first actually it was the first meeting on the Capitol Hill about the coronaviruses, February 5th. Ami Bera, who's the chairman of the Foreign Affairs Committee on the Asia Pacific, and I'm the lead Republican. And it was interesting because the State Department didn't want us to have that meeting. We had that meeting, we highlighted that, and there were some things that came out that really need to be followed up on. And it goes back to transparency and honesty. And when we get to a point where we can trust people, one of the basic tenets of business, and I think in foreign policy, is we do business with people we know, we like, and we trust. And if we can't have those three parameters, it's hard to build lasting foundational relationships. And I think that's something we really need to look at. In answer to your other question, one of the ways you brought up, and it was that question from that candidate, is the supply chain. And yes, the supply chain should be moved. And it's interesting because we, for the last probably a little over 2 years, we've been promoting a policy of manufacture the ABC method. And that's manufacture anywhere but China. I hear from our AmChams and our different corporations that go over there what a large market it is, but yet I've been told over and over again, within 5 years, if they haven't made their profit, the Chinese party, the Communist Party, has copied that product and they're competing with that. And so I asked those people, why do you stay there? And they said, well, it's such a large market. And I want to grab them by the shoulders and turn them in 180 degrees, say, yeah, that's 1.4 billion people there, but there's 6 billion people over here. Let's market there. And this goes back to what I was saying, economically, if we start taking that manufacturing base out of China, that economic power or pain will be felt by not just Xi Jinping, but the Chinese Communist Party, that there already is that tension in there. And again, I want to do everything we can to avoid a kinetic conflict. But when you start talking about accountability, you see what China is doing in the South China Sea. They're challenging sovereignty of all the ASEAN nations, or several of them. They're laying claim to the Arctic, even though they're not an Arctic nation, and that is the norm. But yet now their claim is we are a near Arctic nation. And so if we don't hold them accountable today, the question is this: will it be easier in 3 years from now, or will it even be possible? And so those tough stances, I think, need to be made sooner than later.
Yanshan, let me, I want to go a little deeper on sort of China's domestic situation as a result of the pandemic. People have argued for a long time that the Chinese have a kind of implicit, I should say, bargain with their rulers, sort of accepting certain limits on freedom as would be defined in the West in exchange for rapidly improving economic conditions. But it seems likely now that China's economy can't continue to improve for the next number of years as it has, as quickly as it has over the last generation. And in particular, that the goal, which was publicly announced, of doubling China's GDP in the decade leading up to the 2021 100th anniversary of the Communist Party, that goal may well not be possible to be reached. So does this lead to the possibility of instability, political and civil instability in China? And would that be an opportunity for the United States or a terrible danger?
Well, I think we have to look at the legitimate base of the Chinese Communist Party, right? The current legitimacy is performance-based, right? That means it is rooted on its ability to deliver, right, concrete public goods and services, rapid economic growth. Now we know that because of the COVID-19, right, the economy is slowing down, and there's prediction that this year they might have at best, right, 0 to 2% economic growth. It's very likely the economy is going to shrink instead of grow. So that essentially leads to the questions on how they could beef up its legitimacy, right? So very likely they're going to then look to the second pillar of the legitimacy, that is nationalism. So that probably explain why we have seen this rising, right, this nationalist sentiment, not just among the Chinese public, because we have seen the rising nationalism for a while. I think that nationalism has become only solidified, but even among the elites, a majority of them used to be very pro-American, consciously or unconsciously. They might, say we don't like American, but they don't have any problem sending their kids to the United States, right? But now I've seen this is a dangerous development is that now more and more this on the elite also become less favoring. Their favorable view of American also has been changing, so I think that would be a dangerous development for the United States. This is indeed something actually that I'm very concerned about.
Susan, you want to jump in?
Well, yeah, this is America's losing the hearts and minds of the Chinese people. And Congressman Yoho made the important point that America's differences are not with the Chinese people. They're with the Chinese Communist Party and the policy, especially of Xi Jinping. And I agree with that. But the fact of the matter is the Chinese Communist Party is a huge organization, about 90 million people. And there isn't a huge amount of opposition to the party in the Chinese public. And even though there was this rising up of anger and criticism toward Xi Jinping and toward Beijing at the very beginning of this epidemic because of the cover-up in Wuhan, which is something that was tragic, and people died in Wuhan because of China's control of information, and Dr. Li became a martyr figure, a focus of this tremendous anger and criticism. But very quickly, the public opinion has really turned around in China because people feel that the government actually did a good job of protecting them from the disease. Now, the way they did that is not something we could ever do or would ever want to do, because it required a kind of police state, as well as this social policing by neighborhood leaders in every part of China, even rural China. And they put very strict controls on mobility. But the fact of the matter is, it really was effective. And so people now look at the United States, which is in complete disarray because of the lack of strong leadership at the federal level. And they make the comparison. Now, the propaganda apparatus is highlighting that for them, for sure. And their they don't have full access to information because of censorship. But they still have gotten a clear contrast between China now going back to work, and in America, we haven't yet really gotten control over the epidemic. So public opinion in China now has become, everybody's rallying around the flag, and rallying around the party leadership. So our effort to hold China accountable, and this notion that they purposefully lied in order to harm us, is something that simply really alienates the Chinese people, and in the long run, that's going to be a very serious problem for US policy, that there's very little sort of affinity and respect for the United States, or less and less. We don't know really what the public opinion is, but we have a sense that the anti-US sentiment is becoming extremely strong there, as Yan Zhong said.
So, Congressman, the focus of that anti-US sentiment seems to be coming on the Secretary of State in a significant measure, right? So both the Secretary of State and the President, as obviously you know, have been publicly saying that there is non-public evidence that the virus was unleashed not by purely natural events, but by an accidental release from a Chinese laboratory. So none of us have access to that information. Well, I should say most of us, you perhaps do, Congressman, in some certain circumstances, but the rest of us don't have access to the non-public information. But I guess my question for everyone here is, if the allegation being made by the Secretary of State is correct, what should the American response be? And I'll leave it to whoever wants to jump in first.
I'll go ahead. I'm going to go back. I can tell you what I do know that's out there in the public. When we had that hearing, February 5th, we had two epidemiologists, and my background is in veterinary medicine, and we dealt with herd management and viruses and outbreaks and all that. And I asked them, did they feel that the forensic was done sufficiently at the fresh market or wet market to find the epicenter, the primary source of this? And they said no. Well, the reports we had was that the Chinese government, the Communist Party, had bulldozed that down. And I brought up the question. I says, I'm not speculating, but it's kind of interesting that the most advanced biological weapons factory was within 4 miles. In addition to that, the response that China did, immediately locking down the Hubei province, roughly 50 million people, and then they went on and they built those massive, large-scale hospitals immediately. The response outweighs the threat of the virus in the beginning, because we didn't know a whole lot about it. So that gives the speculation, did they know something we didn't? In addition to that, it was estimated that over 5 million people left that area and disseminated throughout the world. And so those bring up more questions. And one of the other questions that came up was the DNA strand of the COVID-19 virus. That was not shared immediately. And we had offered CDC help. They rejected our help. And I'm not clear if the DNA sequencing of that virus, the original one, is the one that has been shared. And there is speculation that it is not. Now, as far as malicious intent, that's going to be something that history books will, it'll be like the John F. Kennedy murder, the assassination. That'll go on for time. The thing that we have to have is trust. And if we don't have trust, it's hard to move forward. And you know, I'm gonna stop there and let somebody else answer.
Let's hear what Yan Zhong has to say about the sharing of the information, because one thing I noticed in Ambassador Cui's statements and his op-ed yesterday in the Washington Post is he frequently says that the Chinese CDC and the US CDC were in frequent contact with one another after January 4th. On the US side, we say that China wouldn't talk to us. So I don't really know what the facts are.
Well, I think, thank you. I think I agree with Congressman Yoho, and that probably we're going to never find out exactly what happened there. And Susan, to your question, I think well, the Chinese side insisted that they started to share the information with the US CDC beginning on January 3rd. And there are more than 30 times, according to them, sharing. But we don't know what kind of information they're sharing. It's just maybe just a phone call or anything that will count as one communication. But in terms of that issue, that the leak of this virus from that biological lab in Wuhan, first of all, I don't think this is going to be like a weaponized agent, because it's very clear China has no incentive, in my opinion, no needs to develop biological weapons now that have second strike nuclear capability. So for deterrence purpose, there is no need to develop biological weapons. But there's indeed this hypothesis of this biosafety accident, leak of the virus from the lab in Wuhan, because they're just circumstantial evidence can be overwhelming. You could easily point it out, for example, right, that these biological lab, the researchers been working on the coronavirus, and even published in November 2015, they recreated the SARS type of virus, right? They also talk about, well, this is the January 3rd, the National Health Commission, they issued a document to all the biosafety level 3 and 4 labs, asking them, to basically destroy all the samples, right, that collected or received from Wuhan. And then they also, I think, despite the U.S. request, right, the persistent request, refused to let the U.S. CDC experts to visit Wuhan, even during the WHO delegation's trip to Wuhan in February. The U.S. experts was excluded from that trip. And they also refused, actually, WHO to involve in the investigation of the origin of the virus. But all this evidence is circumstantial, as I say. There's no smoking gun evidence to point to the actual leak of the virus from the lab. And I doubt that the information that the Secretary Pompeo has will consist of any smoking gun evidence. There very likely will be all open source information. And as I like to say, if there is any smoking gun evidence, he would have already shown it. And if there is any smoking gun evidence, then China might have already eliminated. So probably we're never going to find out what exactly happened behind that.
I agree.
Thank you. Let me just take a moment to remind our audience we'll be coming up on questions pretty soon from you. So you can use your raise hand button to get recognized for that. Let me change the subject a little bit, although it's certainly related, to the issue of human rights in China and how that factors or should factor into American policy towards China. It seems to wax and wane as a discussion point in our politics about China. Sometimes people stress particular issues of human rights, and sometimes it really seems to take a back seat to both the economic and the geopolitical relationship. But there are facts that are stubborn in terms of the treatment of the Uyghurs in China, and as Susan was pointing out, the method in which the quarantine was enforced. There are certainly people around the world who saw little snippets of video of people being forcibly removed from their homes. On the one hand, on the other hand, there were people who were forcibly locked in their homes. So going forward, as we reformulate policy towards China, how important do each of you feel like human rights should play? Susan, why don't you start?
I could start. I mean, I've been writing on human rights problems in China since the 1970s, and even at a time when individual freedom in China obviously has improved tremendously compared to the Mao era when I started studying China. So, but the limitations on speech, political speech, religion, especially any organized efforts, and the limitations on civil society, reflect the extreme insecurity of the Chinese Communist Party and their worries that one day if there are economic problems, the growth rate slows, that they could face their own new Chinese revolution. So, and under Xi Jinping, this kind of stability maintenance effort, social control, has only gotten more totalitarian. So it's bad. It is definitely bad. So the question is what to do about it. So based on my own experience when I was in the State Department, and we worked very hard on these issues in the Clinton administration, I really despair of the ability of outside governments or outside civil society organizations to bring about change in human rights in China. No matter how much we name and shame them, they don't like that naming and shaming, but it doesn't really seem to have much impact. And, you know, we tried to do a lot of things like rule of law, cooperation, and actually improved the court system quite substantially, but still it operates under the control of the Chinese Communist Party. So there are limits to how far foreigners can really achieve this. So I guess the question is, you know, what do we do about that? Do we simply, you know, try to decouple from China in the way that I think many people are now talking about? Do we, even the whole notion of holding China accountable, do we hold China accountable for its human rights abuses? What does that really mean? I think we have to be realistic that the leverage of the United States, it's not what it once was. And China has tremendous market power. It has a lot of leverage. And if we actually go down the road of decoupling and pressuring our businesses to leave China and reducing the interdependence between us, we'll have even less leverage than we did before, than we do now. So it will not only be costly to the American consumer and to the American economy, but we'll have even less influence than we have now. So I don't have the answer, but I think especially now, what we have to do is we have to hold our nose. There are so many things about China we object to, and I think there's a consensus among us about those things, but we simply can't let it prevent us from finding a way to work together to save lives in this pandemic. And so that's a difficult choice to make, but we can be very principled and get on our high horse about holding China accountable, or we can just be practical. And I believe at this point in time, cooperating with China is the practical way forward.
Congressman, your view here?
I agree a lot with what Susan says. But when it comes to human rights, and you said, Susan, we used to hold these in such a high standard, and we still do, but do we really? When you start looking around the world, you know, you can look in Central America, some of the countries we trade with. We trade with China, our largest trading partner, or they were. But yet we know the Uyghur situation, the East Turkestan situation. We know what's going on in Hong Kong, the suppression of human rights, what their pressure on Taiwan is. If we really do believe these things as a nation, and you said if we back off, we lose our leverage, I would beg to differ on that, because I think if we lead the way and say we're not tolerating this, and we put that pressure on our corporations like Nike did when they were using the slave labor, and it's come out again that some of our corporations are using the Uyghur slave labor. I think if we do that and we stand with that, we start drawing the line, because keep in mind what China is doing. They are offering an alternative to Western democracies. And I think one of you brought it up. Look how messy it is. And it is. And Ben Franklin forewarned us that to over 200 years ago. It's a republic, ma'am, if you can keep it. They're offering their form of socialism with Chinese characteristics. So they're dividing the world. It's a tectonic shift in world powers we haven't seen since World War II. And at what point do you make that stand on principle? Or do you just kind of say, well, yeah, they are doing this, and so we bend our rules and we just adopt, and yeah, we turn a blind eye. And I think it's time that, I really do think it's time that we need to make a hard stand. And I would think corporations would do that. I would think allies would do that. You've seen what they've done with Taiwan through the Belt Road Initiative with islands in the South Pacific and Central America, getting people to break relationships with Taiwan through money incentives, through intimidation, through coercion. And again, if we don't make a stand 5 years from now, when we look back, are we going to say, I wish I would have, I don't know why we didn't, or I'm glad I did? And I'd rather be in the proactive one and say, you know, I'm glad we took a stand when we did.
Yancheng, you want to weigh in on this?
Okay, well, I agree with Susan and Congressman Yoho that I think human rights should be an important objective of U.S. foreign policy and U.S.-China policy in particular. And certainly what China has all this, has its own human rights issues. And I think even China admitted that, you know, there's now, you know, situation seems to be getting a little bit more complicated here when you look at all those tightened social control, right? Crackdown on social media, crackdown, you know, on household churches, you know, and the imprisonment of, you know, church leaders. You know, I think this is something I think the U.S. should indeed pay attention to. And in our dealing with China, I should think we should not sacrificing, you know, our human rights, our principle, you know, for you know, trading, you know, in trading with achieving trade deals with China. I think, but in the meantime, I think we should pick our fight. As Susan said, we have just not so many issues with China, right? We just need to prioritize and pick our fight and know which one actually is the area that we are going to, the cooperation is going to bear fruits, right? Because now, you know, I sense that, you know, even though, you know, the United States, you know, say we care about human rights in China, but what about the Chinese people? My sense is many of them actually don't appreciate that, you know, when it comes to human rights. Many of the people you talk to in China would say, you know, they would interpret as the U.S. being unfriendly to China, trying to contain China's rise. So I do believe, you know, this quiet diplomacy instead of naming and shaming, and the continued engagement would be important in dealing with China and the human rights record issue.
Of course, the most important thing we can really do is to be a good example and to engage in, you know, political reform in America. We are always calling for reform in China, and unfortunately that impulse has slowed down in China. We need a lot of political reform in the United States.
Yeah, absolutely. As I think many of our problems actually are not caused by China, but, you know, I think it's important to keep that in mind. You know, if we want to reinvigorate our liberal democracy, you know, reinvigorate America, we need to actually fix our house in order first.
I agree.
Sounds like a good moment to turn to questions from the audience. First question is Barbara Kroberger. Okay, maybe Barbara had to leave us. We're going to go on to Kalichi Kalu.
Thank you for taking my question. Given China's desire for industrialization to match or overtake the US, and United States promotion of free market without responsibility. To what extent is COVID-19 a warning that destroying forests without regard to their content will exert its vengeance on us? And I'm asking this question because of the connection between animals and human infections. Thank you.
Greg, I'm going to ask you to, could you define that question? I couldn't hear it real well.
Sorry. So I think the essence of the question is that the United States has promoted industrial development in the world, particularly in China, and has benefited from the products, the low-cost products. But that part of the consequence of that is deforestation and the encroachment of human civilization in China on wildlife. And that may have something to do with the spread of these kinds of novel viruses going forward.
That's absolutely true. If you look at the literature, 6 to 7 out of 10 zoonotics that people get originate in the animal world. And the closer we get to the animal world, you know, in dense populations, the more you're going to see these. China right now has African swine fever going through it, which has a 98% mortality rate in the pig population. If something like that were to transport or transfer over to being able to affect human, that would be very, very serious. I mean, that would be the pandemic we don't ever want to see. And so, you know, the whole thrust of bringing China into the modern world, when you look at Jimmy Carter, Richard Nixon, and all the presidents since, was the hopes that they would become more Western democratized. And they had gone closer to that, and then Tiananmen Square happened. Deng Xiaoping, they kind of pivoted, the hardliners came out. And when Xi Jinping took over, it was a different ball game. And I remember this very clearly. When he took over, he was saying, we're going to rid our country of any Western influence. And they have done that. They have suppressed their people. They have the CCT cameras. They're living the Orwellian society of 1984. They're forcing the Uyghurs to change their name, shave their beard. You know, there is no freedom of religion and speech. And you have to understand, and I'm sure you do, the highest entity in China is the Communist Party. There is no deity above that. And their goal is to serve the Chinese Communist Party. So Kalichi was correct in saying the more we encroach on the wildlife, I think you'll see more of these, and viruses do mutate. And that's something, just as an aside, we've got a bill we put in with Kurt Schrader, who's a Democrat out of Oregon, the other veterinarian in Congress, called the Emergency Preparedness and One Health Act, that coordinates USDA, HHS, DHS, and things like that. And then we just put in a request for authorization and funding, Dr. Bear out of California, for the CEPI, so that the United States invests in CEPI, which is the Coordinated Epidemic Preparedness Innovations, and we have not invested in that like other countries around the world. So these are things that we can do, and that would bring China in, so that we're all working together on these things, so that we're prepared for that next pandemic or epidemic. And it's not a question of if, it's when, and we want to be prepared.
Let me jump on to next question from Robert Larrick. Give that one more try, see if Robert Larrick is still with us. Okay, we have another one coming in from Florence Magni.
Thank you. I'm right here. Can you hear me properly?
Yes.
Thank you. Thank you for your presentation. It was very interesting. I think that something to consider is not just US-China relations in this, but also the international perception of China and US around the world. You touched a lot on China's accountability issues, but I would like to talk a little bit about the US accountability in global matters, especially lately, cutting funds of the WHO with an extremely unpredictable president. You could even look at immigration policies, dropping out of Paris. So like the US has some history of, taking a step back in global matters to the extent that, even when he talks about disinfecting and injecting oneself with disinfectant, those news get around the world and people lose a lot of respect for this country when they hear things like that. So to that extent, what is the US accountability with the world problems? And to the other point that I would like to be touched upon would be, we talked about the anti-Chinese sentiment only being toward the Chinese Communist Party, but recently, I'm not sure if you know, there were some news that mentioned OPT, so like the international students optional professional training extension being cut and perhaps being targeted only to Chinese students. So again, I would like to see to talk about that, to what extent it's just to the Communist Party and not to Chinese people.
Lawrence, thank you. Susan, would you like to go first on that one?
Well, I'd like to hear what the congressman has to say about that. I do feel that the United States has abdicated from international leadership. This is in the past when we had epidemics like this, the United States stepped forward and was extremely active, made major investments and diplomatic efforts of getting other countries on board to have international solutions. I mean, this is a global problem. There's no way for the United States to solve the problem alone. So it really takes global leadership. And the United States is abdicating. China actually doesn't appear to be very capable of organizing any kind of effective global effort. It seems to be much more focused on getting credit and praise from other countries for itself. So, it's what you have is anarchy. You have an absence of leadership, and the consequences are going to be really quite dire. So I think we have a lot to answer for in the United States, frankly. I think we've failed so far in how well we've handled the challenge domestically. It's been extremely messy. Our federal system, the federal professional service has been severely decimated by the effort to make our government smaller. We want an efficient government, but we want a government that actually helps protect the American people and provide the kind of safety net that we need. So it's a really very unfortunate circumstance. One other thing I want to say is that the consequences of a hostile relationship between the United States and China, which both governments are really expressing right now, it also has severe consequences for Chinese Americans, and in fact, all of Asian Americans, because it is fine for us to say our problem is with the Chinese Communist Party, but as the questioner just said, our policies are focusing on Chinese people in the United States and Chinese Americans too, with a suspicion that they are somehow spying for China, carrying out intellectual property theft. We see this happening on university campuses. And so it's become so bad that there are Asian American young people I know who really are scared to go out on the street because they worry about being harassed or even violently assaulted. We have a history in the United States. You know, today's the anniversary of the Exclusion Act against Chinese. And so we do have a history of anti-Chinese as well as anti-Japanese policies. So we really have to be extremely cautious about this, because Chinese people, Chinese Americans have been great contributors to the American society, American science, American economy.
The former Prime Minister of Australia, now the President of the Asia Society, wrote a piece in Foreign Affairs yesterday, Kevin Rudd, in which he said, I think something similar to part of what you were suggesting, Susan, and that is that, and also what our questioner was suggesting in a lot of ways, which is that the winner of, quote unquote, winner of the competition, enhanced competition between the United States and China that's been brought about by the pandemic is likely to be neither the United States nor China, but basically anarchy in the world. Without constructive engagement between the United States and China, the world is sort of left in disorder, and that the beneficiaries of that are anarchists of one kind or another, sort of troublemakers, if you will, of one kind or another internationally. Is that a thought that people would on this panel agree or disagree with? And to the extent that you do agree, I guess my sort of final question here is, what do we do to prevent that worst case scenario from happening? Yan-Cheng, let me start with you.
Well, okay, for those of us who study international relations, we know, right, that this international politics is characterized by anarchy, right? Because there is no world government. You know, people like to say, look to WHO for leadership, you know, as if it was like a super governmental organization, but it's not. It is a member state agency, organization. So, you know, that the self-help under this anarchy is according to Kenny's words, you know, the guru of international relations theory, the self-help is the primary principle in conducting international relations. But that being said, it's precisely that we have so many global problems, common challenges that require us to, you know, come together, right, to sit down and talk about how we can cooperate, how we can coordinate, right, to address these common challenges, to solve, you know, these problems caused by this anarchy. And so, you know, I agree with Mr. Rudd, the need for cooperation, but I don't believe that anarchy is a result of this pandemic.
Susan?
Well, I haven't given up on the good sense of the American people. You know, we do have an election coming up, and we have the opportunity to hopefully to have our, you know, to make our choices. And I hope that there will be more voices of people advocating a kind of practical approach to US-China relations right now. And, you know, we can worry later. By the way, I just want to say that I agree with Congressman Yoho that there is going to be a need for paying attention to the resilience of our supply chains, and that we will want to make sure that we're not overly dependent on any one country for the products that are absolutely essential to the health and safety of America. And even at a higher cost, we'll have to figure out a way to diversify the sources so that we don't have to depend on any one country. So, I mean, there'll have to be adjustments, but right now, let's just be practical about, you know, picking. I really wish that Vice President Pence would simply pick up the phone, call Li Keqiang, and say, look, we are the two heads of our COVID task forces. we need to be talking to each other regularly. We need to be, coordinating our efforts to do it in a way to eliminate the red tape so we can make sure that we have high quality medical supplies going. And then we need to be working together to help the developing countries that are really going to bear the greatest brunt of this disease. And we're going to need to work together on the development of therapies and vaccine and fairly distributing the vaccine. I mean, it'll be a nightmare if now this kind of nationalist sentiment that we're seeing so strongly in the United States and in China dominates the distribution of vaccine after we have a vaccine. The scientists are working together and the governments need to be working together too.
Congressman, a final thought if you have one. We're out of time.
Yeah, I just want to touch on what Florence said. She brought up a question, and I think, Yan-Chan, you were right. You know, we should worry about our own house and get our own house in order. Cutting funding to the WHO, I stand with President Trump on that, and for various reasons. You know, the placating that Secretary Tedros did with Beijing, saying that it had everything under control, they did everything right, yet all these people were leaving, going around the world. They postponed calling it a pandemic until later on when they should have done it earlier. And so I stand with President Trump, cutting funding until we get a new director there. Dropping out of the Paris climate, I'm okay with that. You know, when you look at the United States policies, we've cut CO2 emissions by 14% in the last last 5 to 9 years, whereas China's increased, and they're increasing their CO2 output, and that would have put an economic hardship on the American people. Granted, nothing like what we've seen with what's going on right now. And then the intimidation of China on nations to change history. If you look at the college professors in Australia and other countries, China has asked them to rewrite history. If you look at Hollywood, Hollywood will rewrite movies to not offend Beijing instead of being factual. I would point people to the documentary that President Obama did called American Factory. I think that's very clear stated, and I would not recommend anybody drink Clorox or inject it.
Well, that's going to have to be the last word. I want to thank our three guests here for sharing their experiences and their insights. This is the most important relationship in the world between the United States and China, and you've helped illuminate it for our audience. I want to thank everyone who attended this session of the Council by Council Amplified Ideas Summit. Remember to support your local World Affairs Council, and we hope to see you back with the World Affairs Council of Philadelphia shortly. We're adjourned.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.